Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere less than glamorous. You're standing in a muddy pen. Pigs grunt lazily in the corner. The smell is unforgettable, and not in a good way. And a nervous couple stands just inches from a snorting sow. A few neighbors are there, one holding a half-eaten turnip. The local reeve yawns. A priest may or may not show up. But this isn't punishment, it's a wedding. And according to medieval law, completely legit. You heard that right. Some medieval weddings really did happen in pigsties. Not metaphorically, not insultingly, literally. Inside pigsties, next to actual pigs. Why? That's what we're going to unravel tonight. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge forward with curiosity and maybe a bit of regret as your boots squelch in mud. In the distance, there's a flickering torch, and beyond it, a hunched couple waiting anxiously for someone to declare them husband and wife. It's not exactly your dream wedding, but in some medieval villages it was the only wedding people could afford or be allowed to have. Here's the twist. These muddy unions weren't born of chaos or rebellion. They were perfectly legal. In fact, canon law, the Catholic Church's mighty rule book, only required 3 things for a valid marriage: mutual consent, public declaration, and no existing spouse. That's it. No cathedral, no feast, no rings, no white dress, and definitely no licensed florist arranging baby's breath near a hog trough. This minimalist approach had a strangely democratizing effect. Anyone could marry, anywhere, as long as others heard them say yes. The field, the barn, even the pigsty, these were public spaces where people saw you, which was all that mattered. Now, let's acknowledge something here. Today, if someone told you they tied the knot beside a pig, you'd assume it was either a metaphor or a YouTube prank. But back then, it made perfect sense. The pigsty was often central to rural life. You visited it every day. It was one of the few communal places not controlled by the church or the manor. And, importantly, pigs didn't judge. Plus, pigs had economic symbolism. A couple marrying in a sty might be signaling shared property or, ironically, ambition. That pig, that was meat, money, and manure, all precious resources. Starting a marriage next to it wasn't disgraceful. It was practical. Romantic? Maybe not. But if you've ever split a bill on the first date, you get it. The earliest written mention of sty-side weddings comes from scattered parish records and ecclesiastical debates, mostly from the 13th and 14th centuries. Priests complained about it, naturally, but they couldn't forbid it, because the law said location doesn't invalidate consent. Historians still argue whether pigsty weddings were widespread, or just sensational outliers. Some say they were rare accidents of poverty and isolation. Others believe they were normal among lower classes, like a courthouse wedding with livestock in attendance. One delightful fringe theory that certain saints, particularly rural ones, were believed to bless animals, so marrying near them brought fertility. Yes, marrying beside pigs might have been a folk fertility ritual disguised as legal necessity. Try working that into your vows. But don't get too comfortable with the idea just yet. There's more mud to wade through. Some clerics loathed these ceremonies and tried, often in vain, to ban them. Others turned up with pocketbooks open, ready to charge sty fees for the honor of presiding. Capitalism always finds a way. And here's your nightly reality check. If you were a peasant in medieval Europe, the odds of marrying in a clean, dry place with music and a feast were slim. You didn't choose the wedding of your dreams. You chose the one that wouldn't bankrupt your family or get you excommunicated. Still, for all their stench and simplicity, these weddings lasted. Many of them were as legally binding as a royal union, and some even outlasted the more glamorous ones, because once you've promised lifelong loyalty in a pig pen, what else could possibly scare you? You wipe the mud from your sleeves, not that it helps. The wedding's over, the pigs are still snorting, and the newlyweds are already trudging back to their shared thatch roof cottage. There's no reception, just leftover pottage and maybe a crust of bread. It's hard to believe that this counts as holy matrimony, but it does. And to understand how we got from "I do" in a pigsty to white dresses and pews, we need to ask a bigger question. Where could people legally get married in the Middle Ages? Let's start with a surprising truth. The church building itself was optional. In fact, before the 12th century, most weddings didn't happen inside churches at all. The sacred part was the vow, not the venue. By the time canon law got formalized, the church started recommending ceremonies be blessed at the door of the church, outside where the public could watch. But even that was more suggestion than requirement. This meant marriage didn't belong solely to priests. It belonged to the couple and to the crowd. That's right. What mattered most was the audience. You couldn't sneak off and get secretly married with no one watching. Well, you could, but it wouldn't hold up in court. A few neighbors, a cousin or two, maybe the miller's wife peeking over the fence. That was the real binding agent of medieval matrimony. And if the church was closed too far or charging outrageous fees, you got married wherever you could gather a crowd, in the courtyard, in the garden, on the village green, or in the nearest pigsty, because pigs don't charge admission and your relatives were already feeding them. Historians still argue whether these out-of-church weddings were more common in villages than in cities. Urban elites, of course, preferred sanctified halls and gold-leafed hymnals, but the average peasant had neither the money nor the social pull to reserve a church. Add to that the rising trend of plague, warfare, and travel bans, and suddenly marrying wherever you stood didn't just seem practical, it was necessary. That's not to say people were indifferent to the idea of a sacred space. Quite the opposite. Many believed that certain spots, even outside the church, held spiritual weight. A barn used for storing wheat might feel holy because food was life. A pigsty could symbolize fertility and daily survival. And the family field? That was ancestral land. What could be more sacred than that? Still, legal headaches abounded. Say you got married behind your cottage with only 2 sheep and your uncle to witness. Years later, you're dragged into court over inheritance. Guess what the judge asks? Where's the priest? Where's the proof? Suddenly, those pigs look like a very unconvincing notary. To prevent this, local clergy began pushing harder for formal documentation. Enter the parish register, a dusty ledger kept by bored monks who wrote things like, June 6th, John, pig farmer, wed to Maud, washerwoman, behind the stable. Witnesses, 1 cow, 3 children, no objections. These records helped, but they also exposed how often weddings took place in locations the church never approved. One charming fringe tidbit. In parts of medieval France, couples sometimes married on bridges. Why? Because it symbolized crossing into a new phase of life. Also, everyone could see you. Public, symbolic, and slightly dangerous. Perfect medieval recipe. Back in England, some dioceses tried to lay down firmer rules. Marry inside, pay your tithe, get your blessing. But rural areas resisted, not because they were rebellious, but because the system didn't fit their reality. If your local chapel was 12 miles away and you owned 1 mule, shared with your cousin, you weren't trekking there in your wedding tunic. So the church made peace with improvised spaces. The pigsty wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. It was public. It was symbolic. And you definitely wouldn't forget the smell. By the late 14th century, laws tried to codify more uniform wedding rites. But enforcement? Spotty. One bishop wrote furiously about couples marrying in disgraceful, dung-filled surroundings. Another shrugged and said, well, at least they're not fornicating. And therein lies the paradox. The church cared deeply about sexual morality, but less about where you tied the knot, so long as it was legal. You could marry in muck, and as long as you weren't also marrying your cousin or your goat, the paperwork stood. So next time you see a velvet aisle runner or a gold-trimmed altar, spare a thought for the medieval couple who stood barefoot beside a manure heap and said the same words. Their love story, legally binding, eternally pungent. You're still rubbing your nose from that last scene, wondering how anyone could start married life ankle-deep in pig droppings. But you're also starting to realize that in the Middle Ages, the definition of sacred was surprisingly flexible. Which brings us to something odd, even by medieval standards. Sometimes Weddings didn't just happen near filth, they were almost expected to. Church records and legal commentary suggest that some places became accidental traditions for certain kinds of unions, which leads us to one of the strangest pairings in history: holy vows and filthy floors. You squelch your way toward another medieval village. This one smells even worse. A bride stands awkwardly in the middle of what appears to be a cattle shed. Two neighbors look on. One is holding a goose, the other's asleep. And yet again, this counts, not just socially, legally, spiritually. Welcome to the glorious complexity of medieval wedding law. Let's break it down. In many rural areas, the line between civil, religious, and domestic life was almost non-existent. The same barn could host a grain harvest, a pig slaughter, and a wedding all in the same week. Efficiency? Absolutely. Hygiene? Don't get your hopes up. The church tried, oh, how it tried, to bring dignity to the institution of marriage. By the 12th century, canon lawyers were outlining procedures. Banns must be read, oaths must be witnessed, and unions should ideally take place at the church door. But that last part? More like a suggestion, because as we've seen, the reality of medieval logistics could trump sacred idealism. Historians still argue whether these offbeat weddings were more about poverty or convenience. Some say they were simply what peasants could afford. No inns, no cathedrals, no banquet halls. Others suggest a more superstitious angle, that certain smelly or dirty spaces were seen as protective. Pigs, after all, were considered hardy animals. Some folk beliefs held that marrying near them could absorb bad omens. You might be stinky, but you'd be spiritually bulletproof. And then there's the legal loophole. According to canon law, the consent between the man and woman, spoken aloud in present tense, was the actual foundation of marriage. Everything else was decoration. No priest, no problem. No altar, not necessary. Say, I take thee while standing in a puddle of pig pee, and congratulations, you're married. This worried the church deeply, not because it didn't count, but because it did. People could get married without them. And when people started doing that in increasingly odd places, like pigsties, kitchens, and even latrines, the church had a branding crisis on its hands. Let's take a detour into a delightful medieval court case. A couple named Giles and Marga married, as far as anyone could tell, behind their cottage next to the chicken coop. There was no priest, no formal ceremony, just loud vows and some shocked hens. Years later, when Giles tried to abandon Marga for a wealthier widow, Marga dragged him into ecclesiastical court. Her evidence? 3 neighbors had heard the vows while feeding ducks. The court ruled in her favor. Verdict: binding marriage. Location: poultry adjacent. Romance: debatable. Here's a fringe tidbit you'll enjoy. In parts of Central Europe, Couples who couldn't afford anything else sometimes said their vows in their shared latrine. Yes, the outhouse. Why? It was private, technically on their property, and had just enough space for two and a witness. One priest, upon discovering this, wrote that no sacrament should be solemnized amidst human waste, which only made people more curious to try. It's around this time that bishops began to panic. One 14th century Reform Council even tried to ban outdoor weddings entirely, demanding all ceremonies happen inside churches. It failed, miserably. The villagers mostly ignored it, and some even held weddings farther from the church out of spite. The problem, of course, was that the church's power wasn't universal, especially not in rural areas where literacy was low and clergy were few. A wedding needed presents, not paperwork. If the village accepted your union, it held, even if the priest was off hunting or sleeping off too much ale. So here you are, in yet another medieval village, watching another muddy ceremony. The couple exchanges oaths with laughter. Someone gives them a piglet as a wedding gift. There's no choir, no ring bearer, no garter toss, just mud, sweat, and maybe a song or two. It's crude, it's real, and it's legally binding, and strangely, it's starting to feel almost sweet. These weren't weddings built for Instagram. They were built for survival, cooperation, and social stability. The pigsty may have been filthy, but the vows, those were clean. You're getting used to the smell now. Not that you'd ever admit it. There's something earthy, grounding even, about these muddy ceremonies. But tonight's journey isn't about nostalgia. It's about uncovering why the pigsty made such a frequent cameo at medieval weddings. And to do that, you'll need to understand the audience. Because in medieval Europe, the most important guests at a wedding weren't always priests or parents. They were the people standing nearby, the public eye. And the pigsty? Oddly enough, it was a great place to be seen. You make your way toward a thatched barn where a couple nervously fumbles through their vows. There's no priest in sight, just a cluster of locals watching from behind a fence. Someone's balancing on a barrel. A child is offering a flower to a chicken. The whole scene is chaotic, smelly, and unforgettable. But here's the key. Everyone is watching, and that makes all the difference. Under medieval canon law, consent was everything, but consent had to be public. Private declarations, even if sincere, were dangerously ambiguous. Public vows meant witnesses, and witnesses meant accountability. You couldn't just deny you were married if 10 people saw you say, "I do," while standing knee-deep in pig mud. And what public places did most villages actually have? Not many. There was the church, expensive, the manor hall, off-limits, and maybe the tavern, already reserved for fights and questionable musicians. But the pigsty, that was free, central, and, most importantly, open to anyone. Historians still argue whether this emphasis on public space reflects a deep-rooted folk legal culture. Some believe medieval villagers trusted community memory more than written records. If 10 neighbors agreed you were married, then you were. No need to involve an archivist or a bishop. One fringe theory suggests that in especially superstitious regions, marrying near animals was also thought to seal the marriage with nature's approval. Pigs, with their earthy intelligence and prolific reproduction, were linked to prosperity and protection. A boar might grunt at your vows, but that grunt symbolic. Now, let's add a wrinkle. In some areas, weddings weren't just held publicly. They were held at crossroads, market stalls, or yes, beside livestock enclosures, because those were the social centers of the village. It wasn't weird. It was practical. You got married where people were already gathering. If that happened to be next to a pig, so be it. And in places where a pigsty stood between the cottage and the well, it actually was the most foot-trafficked spot in town. The community already passed through it every day. Why not get married there? There is also the not-so-glamorous reality of class. For nobles and burghers, the church wedding was a display of status. But for peasants, it was often an impossible expense. The poor used what was around them, and what was around them often oinked. Let's talk drama, because you know there were arguments. Imagine two families at a pigsty wedding. The bride's parents scandalized that there's no priest, the groom's brother offering ale to the witnesses, the local priest sulking because he wasn't paid to officiate, all happening while a pig decides now is the time to give birth in the corner. It's not elegant, it's memorable, and it served its purpose. Once that crowd heard the vows, they became living legal documents. If someone tried to back out, the witnesses could and did testify. Yes, your lordship, they married right next to that old sow. It squealed during the kiss. The church, of course, hated this, not because the weddings weren't real, but because they were without needing a priest. Over time, councils and bishops tried to insist that weddings take place at the church door, under clerical supervision. But enforcement lagged. Priests were few, villages were remote, and pigsties always available. There's a delightful court case where a couple married beside a well-used ox cart surrounded by chickens. The priest arrived late and huffed that the location was improper. The villagers responded by citing 3 prior weddings that took place on the same muddy patch. One of them even joked, "If it's good enough for pigs, it's good enough for love." The marriage stood. This wasn't rebellion, it was resilience. Villagers made the law fit them. They lived hard lives, worked the land, and had no time for elaborate rituals. If a pigsty offered space, visibility, and a crowd, it became their wedding chapel. So next time you see a rustic wedding with mason jars and hay bales, remember there's a long tradition there. though maybe the modern version leaves out the snorting boar. The lights fading now, the wedding guests, both human and porcine, are wandering off. Somewhere nearby, someone starts playing a bone flute, and a celebratory hiccup echoes through the twilight. You hang back a moment, just long enough to catch a whiff of cabbage stew and hear a peal of laughter from the newlyweds' hut. But wait, didn't they already marry last year? Welcome to the wonderful, slightly confusing world of betrothals over barrels, where being almost married sometimes counted just as much as the real deal. In medieval Europe, the line between being engaged and being legally married was more wiggly than we're used to. There was a whole category of union known as hand fasting, a kind of trial marriage or binding betrothal that could happen anywhere, even on a whim, and often did. Picture this. Two young villagers meet at a market. They fancy each other. One's a bit tipsy on mead, the other's just sold 3 goats. They clasp hands over a wine barrel and declare their intention to marry. No priest, no parents, just the two of them, and maybe a dog chewing on a radish nearby. Depending on the region and century, that hand fasting, it might already count. Historians still argue whether hand fastings were considered full marriages or just an intention to wed. In some places, they were taken very seriously, especially if consummated. Yes, in some regions, saying the vows was enough. In others, it was doing the vows afterward that sealed the deal. This created all kinds of legal headaches. A couple might hand fast in a barn one year, then try to marry someone else the next. And suddenly, the local bishop is knee-deep in contradictory oaths and angry relatives. Ecclesiastical courts were flooded with cases that went something like, "I married her behind the granary, but I didn't mean it," or, "Yes, we said vows, but we were only joking." Spoiler: the courts rarely found that funny. In fact, one fringe tidbit from 14th century Yorkshire describes a man trying to escape a hand-fasted wife by claiming he'd used a pig as a proxy during the vows. He insisted the pig grunted affirmatively, which meant it wasn't a valid exchange. The court was unimpressed. The church, of course, wanted none of this mess. It preferred clear, priest-supervised, bands read out loud in church weddings. But again, reality didn't always cooperate. Travel was hard. Priests were busy. And sometimes love, or what passed for it, didn't wait for official schedules. This is where the pigsty comes back in. Many hand fastings took place not in grand halls, but in practical spaces, barns, sheds, and yes, sty-side stalls. You'd find a quiet spot, declare your intention, and if enough neighbors were feeding pigs nearby, they could confirm it later in court. It wasn't just peasants either. Some minor nobles preferred to hand-fast before investing in an expensive full ceremony. One 13th century knight famously hand-fasted his bride on a hay bale, then rode off to war without ever officially marrying her. When he died, 2 women claimed to be his widow. The court picked the one with more pig witnesses. Hand fastings also gave young couples flexibility. You could test the relationship, build up resources, or just survive the next harvest before making things formal. It wasn't unusual for a couple to live as husband and wife by mutual consent for months or years before a priest ever got involved. But this brought risks too. Without written records, marriages could be easily denied. One historian likens the system to legal quicksand. The more you wriggled, the deeper the mess got. And if you changed your mind, good luck. Breaking off a hand fasting was like getting divorced without the paperwork. The church tried to fix this by formalizing engagement as a separate, non-binding step. But rural folk often shrugged. If you said it and someone heard it, you were stuck. So they kept doing what they knew, clasping hands, making vows, and hoping no pigs overheard anything embarrassing. You step into yet another wedding in progress. This one's simple, just two people, a few neighbors, and a cider barrel. They clasp hands, smile, and murmur something half sung, half prayed. No rings, no contract, just mutual promises and a good crowd to remember it. And just like that, they're wed. No white dress, no cake, no seating chart, just the muddy echo of love and maybe a pig squeal to mark the occasion. You've been through fields, barns, and barrel-side ceremonies, and somehow each one makes the pigsty wedding seem less strange. Maybe it's because, for many medieval folks, the pigsty wasn't the outlier. It was just available. And when you're dirt poor, practicality beats pageantry every time. So let's talk about what poverty really meant for weddings back then. Because despite the songs and stories, most medieval marriages weren't about sweeping romance. They were about dirt poor and law-bound survival. You step into a village that looks like it's been carved from mud and held together with straw. The people here don't smile much. They're missing teeth. Their clothes are rough-spun wool, patched with old sacks. And yet, a couple is getting married right in the middle of the pig enclosure, and no one bats an eye. In fact, it's the most cheerful anyone's looked in days. Here's the thing. A church wedding cost money, not just for the service, but for the priest's travel, the bands which had to be read over 3 Sundays, and the various fees that somehow always multiplied like rats in a grain bin. You needed food for guests, a clean tunic, maybe a little token for the bride, flowers, a coin, or if you were really rich, a second-hand veil from the Reeve's daughter. But if you had nothing, you made do. Historians still argue whether the church turned a blind eye to pigsty weddings out of mercy or necessity. Some think rural priests understood the struggle and let poor villagers marry however they could. Others suggest it was simple economics. Charging less or skipping formalities wasn't generosity, it was just cutting corners. One fringe account from a 12th century French village describes a priest who would only marry couples inside the church if they brought him a roasted goose. If they couldn't afford it, he'd stand outside and shout the vows over the hedge. His parishioners called it the holy honk. And while the pigsty sounds unsanitary to modern ears, remember, for these villagers, the sty was part of the home. It was attached to the cottage. It kept pigs warm, which helped heat the walls. And most importantly, it was one of the few places the couple owned. No landlord, no priest, no tax collector, just them and their livestock. To be married there wasn't disgraceful, it was logical, symbolic even. You were promising to share everything with your partner, the work, the food, the cold nights, and yes, the pigs. It also meant you didn't have to take time off work. A wedding in the sty meant you could finish feeding the pigs and say your vows all in one trip. Efficient, if not exactly candlelit. You walk past another marriage in progress. The couple stands on a makeshift platform of hay bales. A single daisy is tucked behind the bride's ear. Her hands are cracked and red from soap making. His tunic is held together with a fishbone pin. They smile like it's the best day of their lives, because it is. There's no wedding cake, but there's stew. There's no harpist, but someone's humming a folk tune about goats and rain. There's mud on everyone's boots, but also laughter in their throats. You can't help but respect it. Now, here's where it gets messier, because even in these simple ceremonies, legal complications loomed. Say a woman was forced into marriage by a family arrangement, or a man later denied the vows ever happened. Without a church record, everything came down to witnesses, and in poor communities, witnesses often disappeared or were busy surviving elsewhere. That's why many pigsty marriages included a simple trick. They placed a visible object between the couple during the vows, something permanent, like a shared pig, a family plow, or even a marked stone. That object could later be used to prove the event had happened. You could go back to the court and say, "We stood right next to that pig when we married." The church never loved these ad hoc traditions, but it couldn't afford to police them all, especially when entire parishes had only one overworked priest. So a quiet agreement formed. As long as the vows were honest and no one was already married, the pigsty wedding would do. One English bishop wrote almost grudgingly, "It is better they be married in muck than not married at all." So you lean against a sty wall, arms crossed, watching another pair exchange muddy oaths. A rooster interrupts halfway through. No one minds. The air smells like hay, sour ale, and optimism, and you think this might just be the most honest wedding I've ever seen. The sun's low now, casting long shadows over the muddy paths and crooked cottages. But in one corner of the village, a group gathers again, this time around a pen filled with squawking geese and one very confused pig. There's laughter, a few spilled tankards, and the smell of parsnip stew drifting through the air. You've stumbled upon another wedding, but this one's a little different, because here you're watching not just a marriage, but a transaction. In many parts of medieval Europe, weddings weren't just about love or even legality. They were economic contracts, sometimes sealed with livestock, land, or a half-dead pig that no one really wanted. And for the poorest couples, where better to finalize a transaction than in the very place their wealth lived? The pigsty? Imagine two families meeting behind a thatched hut. The bride's father offers a small dowry, a jug of cider, a goat, and some threadbare linens. The groom's uncle counters by gifting a piglet, a bag of onions, and the promise not to complain during winter. They shake on it, and then the couple exchanges vows right there in the muck. Historians still argue whether these transactional weddings were born from necessity or deep-rooted cultural norms. Was it survival strategy or a reflection of a society where marriage was fundamentally a transfer of resources, not emotions? Either way, pigsties made excellent backdrops. They symbolized shared assets, offered neutral territory, and, best of all, had pigs, which were both food and currency. In some regions, pigs were so valuable that the groom's ability to offer one as part of a bride price was seen as a mark of true marriage readiness. No pig, no wife. One fringe case from a 13th century Flemish village recounts a groom offering 2 live pigs and 1 butter churn in exchange for his bride. The wedding took place in the family sty, and the pig squealed so loud during the vows that the priest had to bless the union twice, just to be safe. Dowries, of course, varied wildly. Wealthier peasants might offer wool, honey, or tools, but the poor often gave what they had: pigs, hens, or simply the promise of future labor. A bride might be worth 1 sow and 6 months of bread baking. A groom might pledge to keep the pig alive through winter. It wasn't romantic, but it was honest. Sometimes disputes arose. If a marriage dissolved, either through death or desertion, the bride's family might demand the return of their pig. This led to some delightfully odd court records, where a woman sues her ex-husband not for emotional damages, but for 1 spotted sow, age unknown, temperament foul. You lean closer to the wedding unfolding before you. The groom clutches a squirming piglet. The bride's mother eyes it skeptically, clearly calculating bacon potential. A notary scribbles notes beside the pen. No choir, no incense, just grunts, murmurs, and a well-aimed apple thrown at a nosy chicken. And once again, we find ourselves in a space where love and economics blur. Because while the church insisted marriage was a holy sacrament, villagers knew it also meant forming a household, and that meant food, heat, shelter, and cooperation. The pig represented all of that. It wasn't just a barnyard animal, it was a symbol of joined resources, and yes, of future sausage. Now, you might be wondering, did anyone object to this approach? Oh, absolutely, especially the clergy. Many priests ranted against beast-side marriages, claiming they degraded the sacrament. One English cleric wrote, A wedding sealed in filth shall know little grace. But villagers shrugged. They didn't need grace. They needed guarantees. And nothing said commitment like jointly owning a pig with digestive issues. Over time, even the church began to compromise. Some parishes allowed simple, blessing-only ceremonies at the bride's home or in the fields. Others accepted livestock as partial payment for marriage services. And some bishops just stopped asking questions. If a marriage began in a pigsty but ended in fidelity and shared hardship, that was enough. So you linger a little longer, watching the newlyweds lead their piglet home like a fluffy child. The bride giggles. The groom stumbles in the mud. And everyone claps. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was done. And in the Middle Ages, a finished transaction was something worth celebrating. You follow the couple down a muddy lane, the piglet trotting behind like a witness to their vows. No parade, no rice throwing, just a clatter of wooden shoes and the low murmur of neighbors comparing stew recipes. The wedding is over. Life begins. And with it, a deeper question rises. What did medieval couples actually feel about these unions? Because for all the talk of pigs and dowries, there's still something tender buried in the muck. So tonight, you step gently into the world of love in the time of pottage, when affection and survival held hands, and sometimes that was enough. Let's get this out of the way. Most medieval marriages weren't based on romantic love, but they weren't entirely loveless either. In fact, the modern idea that people used to marry only for duty is a bit misleading. Many peasants did grow to love each other. They just didn't always start that way. You wander past a cottage where a couple is finishing their wedding meal, thin soup, some bread, and what might be a turnip pretending to be meat. The bride still has pig hair stuck to her sleeve. The groom's missing half a sandal, but they're smiling, laughing even. There's no fanfare, but there's warmth, a quiet kind of closeness. And that's what most medieval couples hoped for. Before courtship came cooperation. You looked for someone who could work beside you, someone who'd share the plow, mend the roof, carry water, mind the children, and maybe, just maybe, not snore too loud. Love might follow or not, but if it did, it was earned. Historians still argue whether affection played a role in peasant marriages or if it was purely practical. Some letters and songs suggest deep romantic feeling. Others paint a grimmer picture of wives bartered off and husbands chosen for their livestock. The truth, as usual, likely lived in the middle. One fringe discovery, a 14th century ballad found scribbled in the margin of a pig-keeping manual. It tells of a farmer who marries a girl after she helps him rescue a trapped piglet. The song ends with them growing old together, their pigs multiplying like blessings. Romantic? Sort of. Practical? Absolutely. And yet, for all their simplicity, peasant weddings could be deeply meaningful. The act of standing beside someone in mud in public in front of pigs and saying yes wasn't nothing. It was vulnerability. It was courage. It was hope that together you might scrape by a little better than alone. And if you're picturing the bride in a white dress, stop. That came much, much later. Medieval brides usually wore their nicest work tunic, probably still damp from washing it in the river. Some added a flower crown. Others wore ribbons in their hair. But many just tied a cord around their waist and hoped it didn't rain. As for rings, optional, especially if you couldn't afford metal. Some couples exchanged carved wooden bands. Others tied string around each other's wrists. One hilarious German record from the 1300s mentions a groom offering his bride a piece of salted pork as a token of lifelong devotion. Honestly, she could do worse. You crouch beside another wedding in progress. This one's quieter. No feast, no guests, just the couple, an old woman acting as witness, and a pair of pigs sleeping in a corner. They whisper their vows. The woman nods. A rooster crows. And that's it. They're married. There's something strangely beautiful about it. No choreography, no Pinterest board, just two people deciding they'll face whatever comes together. Sure, marriage was still tangled up with land rights, family alliances, and social expectations. But within that, people carved out space for tenderness, jokes, shared chores, small gestures. Love wasn't a requirement, but sometimes it showed up anyway. And when it did, it stuck. Archaeological digs have uncovered side-by-side graves of peasant couples who died in their 80s, still buried near the same fields where they wed. One pair was found near a collapsed barn, with tools still beside them. Married in mud, died in dirt. A love story in its own right. So as you walk back toward the pigsty, stars blinking overhead, you realize that maybe the mud wasn't just a setting. It was part of the vow, an unspoken promise. I'll walk with you through the muck, not just on our wedding day, but every day after. And in a way, that's more romantic than any gilded chapel. You awake to the sound of distant grunting. No, not human, definitely porcine. Another wedding is beginning, and you're just in time. This one feels different, though, less chaotic, almost joyful. The villagers are gathered early. Someone's laid down straw to walk on. A borrowed jug of cider is being passed around. Even the pig is behaving, more or less. This is no accident. You're about to witness something rare. A pigsty or paradise kind of wedding. One where the filth didn't matter because the mood, the meaning, and the community lifted everything above the muck. You perch yourself on a broken fence post, just in view. The bride's cheeks are flushed, not from embarrassment, but from happiness. The groom fumbles with his boots. There's no priest, but there is a village elder who's performed this role more times than he can remember. He clears his throat, lifts a stick like a scepter, and begins. Here's the twist. This pigsty marriage isn't second best. It's a choice, and not an uncommon one, especially among peasants who knew that waiting for a priest or saving for a church ceremony meant waiting a year or more, maybe forever. Better to get on with life, hand in hand, mud or no mud. Historians still argue whether these rustic weddings were expressions of rebellion or just realism. Some see them as acts of defiance, rejecting the formal church monopoly on matrimony. Others see a quiet kind of confidence, villagers making their own space sacred no matter how smelly. One fringe account comes from Wales, 1372. A couple married beside their prized sow, Pinktooth, under a makeshift arch of old broomsticks and apple branches. The groom wore a floral belt. The bride carried a basket of eggs. After the vows, everyone kissed the pig. According to the elder who led it, no union was ever happier. And honestly, why not? The pigsty, for all its grime, had everything you needed: witnesses, symbolism, shelter, and familiarity. It was where you worked, where you kept your wealth, sometimes where you napped. In a world where many marriages were about creating a shared economic future, what better place to start? Besides, it offered unexpected advantages. Pigs were quietly good luck in many regions. Their high birth rates meant fertility blessings. Their strong noses were thought to sniff out lies. One German folk tale claimed that if a pig grunted during your vows, the marriage would be faithful. If it sneezed, the couple would be wealthy. If it pooped, you were destined for twins. You glance back at the wedding and realize the pig has just sneezed. Everyone cheers. The bride raises her arms like she's been blessed by a saint. Someone throws a handful of grain in the air. The groom nearly trips. And here's another truth. Pigsty weddings allowed for intimacy. No strangers, no formal pressure, just the people who mattered. These ceremonies, though small, could be incredibly moving. You didn't have to worry about mispronouncing Latin. You just had to say what you meant in front of people who knew you. One 15th century diary from a miller in Kent describes his daughter's wedding in their barn. They held hands near the pig wall. My wife cried. I wept too. There was no priest, but much joy. Sometimes the community pitched in to decorate. Flowers from the hedgerows, ribbons tied to the pigsty gate, even chalk drawings on barn doors. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to, and that desire to celebrate love, even in the muck, says something beautiful about the human spirit. And the best part, these weddings worked. Many of these couples stayed together for life, raised children, shared fields, argued about stew, slept beneath leaky roofs, and when they died, they were remembered not for where they wed, but for how they lived. You rise from your fence post perch as the couple finishes their vows. There's cheering. Someone hands them a small sack of barley. The pig, now quite sleepy, lies down as if to say, my work here is done. And for just a moment, the sty doesn't smell. Or maybe it does, but no one notices. Because when joy fills a space, even a pigsty feels like paradise. You wander away from the wedding, the laughter still echoing faintly behind you. A few villagers are sweeping up straw. The pig snores peacefully. The sun's dipping lower now, turning the muddy paths gold. But not everything about these weddings was so heartwarming, because as cozy as pigsty vows could be, they also exposed something stickier: the church's muddy hands in the whole affair. You duck into a crooked side lane where a priest is sitting on an overturned bucket, arms crossed, looking deeply unimpressed. He's muttering something about fees unpaid and sacrilege by swine. He was invited, but the couple couldn't afford his services. So now he's sulking, holy and broke. See, here's the thing. By the 13th century, the church really wanted control over marriage. Not just the blessing part, but the whole process. Who could marry, when, how much it cost, and who got to record it. But controlling something so deeply tied to local life wasn't easy, especially when half the weddings were happening behind pig pens. Historians still argue whether the church's motives were spiritual, bureaucratic, or just financial. Many believe it was all three. Clerics wanted marriage to be a sacrament, not a casual event. But they also knew weddings were a cash cow. Fees for bands, blessings, rings, and records, they added up. And if you skipped the church, that was lost income. So pigsty weddings weren't just an insult, they were a tax evasion. This led to a long, awkward dance. Priests would grumble but look the other way. Bishops would issue warnings, then forget to enforce them. And villagers, they played along, sometimes inviting clergy purely for appearances, even if the vows had already been exchanged 3 weeks earlier by the chicken coop. One fringed tale from 14th century Bohemia tells of a priest who demanded payment after the wedding, even though he'd shown up late and drunk. When the couple refused, he cursed the pigsty, and then promptly fell into it. The pig was unharmed. The priest's robes, not so lucky. Still, the church wasn't powerless. Over time, it pushed harder for rules. Banns must be read aloud 3 times. Weddings should happen at church doors. Priests should be present. But rural parishes often lacked enforcement. One overwhelmed bishop admitted, "I cannot follow every pig." That didn't stop some from trying. In certain dioceses, fines were imposed on families who married in muck. Others offered reduced fees for poor couples, only if they married properly in church. It was less about kindness, more about record keeping. A wedding without documentation was a legal headache, and a marriage without fees, an economic disappointment. You peek into another sty wedding in progress. This one does have a priest. He's wearing worn vestments and holding a damp prayer book. He looks slightly embarrassed, especially when the groom hands him a payment, a boiled turnip and a wooden comb. He sighs and mutters the blessing anyway. Truthfully, not all clergy were greedy. Many understood the situation. They lived among these people, knew their struggles, some even adapted. One vicar in Cornwall was known to perform mud blessings outside cottages for free, provided the couple promised to attend Mass afterward. He never kept records. He just trusted the community to remember. But others were less forgiving. Some refused to recognize non-church weddings at all. They shamed couples, denied baptisms for children, or even excommunicated entire families. These were rare but real, and they made the pigsty wedding a quiet form of resistance, a way of saying, "We matter," even without gold chalices. Sometimes, though, the system got creative. To bridge the gap between law and life, some priests held sty masses, quick outdoor services, where they'd bless multiple couples in one go. Think of it like a group wedding, but with pigs instead of doves. One cleric reportedly blessed 7 couples in 20 minutes, pausing only to swat flies and dodge manure. You watch the current priest finish the ceremony. He blesses the couple, half-heartedly pats the pig, then immediately wipes his hand on his sleeve. He walks off grumbling about ale. But the couple beams. They have their marriage, their community, and even their priestly stamp of approval. Sort of. And maybe that's the point. The church tried to formalize marriage. Villagers made it work, even if it meant dragging clergy into the mud. Literally, because love, it turns out, is messier than doctrine. And sometimes it smells like pigs. You trail behind the priest as he disappears into the tavern, possibly to drown his frustrations in something barley-based. The pigsty is quiet again, the couple gone off to begin their life together, with little more than each other and one particularly vocal sow. But just when you think only peasants had to marry among mud and grunts, history surprises you, because sometimes even nobles found themselves swapping rings in a barn, and not by accident. Welcome to the world of when noble noses wrinkled. It's tempting to think that sty-side weddings were exclusive to the lower classes. After all, who else would voluntarily step over a pig to say, "I do"? But records show that under certain circumstances, even the rich and powerful said their vows far from cathedrals, often in rural, animal-adjacent settings. Sometimes it was practical. A noble lord might be traveling, caught in a remote fiefdom when an urgent alliance needed sealing. Marriage wasn't just personal, it was political. If a treaty needed to be honored or a dowry claimed, the ceremony had to happen now, even if the only available shelter was a pig barn with good acoustics. Historians still argue whether these barnside weddings were truly humble or just symbolic gestures, especially when the wedding feast came afterward in a candle-lit hall. But some high-born folk genuinely embraced the rustic vibe. Marrying in a barn could signal fertility, humility, or alignment with the honest laboring classes. It was a political costume party with hay. Take the fringe case of Lady Aveline of Poitou, who insisted on marrying in her family's sheep shed in 1296. Her reasoning? To show that even the high-born may kneel among beasts if love be true. It would have been touching if her gown hadn't spooked the sheep into a frenzy. Then there's the tale of Sir Osmond the miner, who married a merchant's daughter in a barley field next to a swine pen. His family objected vehemently, but Osmond claimed the location symbolized the union of grain and meat. More likely, it was the only place her father allowed, since Osmond still owed him 2 crates of wine. Not all noble pig weddings were poetic. Some were sheer necessity. Wars disrupted travel, plagues emptied churches, and sometimes secrecy was key. If a match was controversial, cross-class, politically inconvenient, or simply scandalous, a quiet ceremony in a barn offered privacy, plausible deniability, and livestock as witnesses who couldn't talk. And then there were the nobles who used rustic weddings as statements. Just like modern billionaires trying to look relatable by wearing flannel, some nobles staged simple weddings to curry favor with the common folk. A pigsty wedding said, "Look, I'm just like you," even if the pig had better dental care than most peasants. Of course, not everyone approved. Clergy muttered about mocking the sacraments. Chroniclers scoffed at noble folly in fetid places. One bishop wrote, "If a lord marries beside pigs, he marries as one," which, to be fair, was exactly the point for some reform-minded nobles trying to shed their reputations. You pass through another village, where stories swirl about a baroness who married her stable-master beside the hayloft. Rumor says she wore a crown of carrot flowers and gave her new husband a piglet with a blue ribbon. Was it love, a land grab, or just exceptionally bad taste? No one's sure, but the wedding stuck in the village memory long after the couple had moved and the pig had grown fat and famous. Even in royal courts there were whispers of hidden barn weddings, illegitimate children, quiet unions, political arrangements done far from the glitter of chapels. Not all of them involved actual pigsties, but the principle held. Sometimes a wedding needed to be fast, discreet, and dirt-ready. And so, once again, the pigsty transcended class. It wasn't just the backdrop for the poor, it was a blank canvas for anyone who needed a wedding to happen outside the bounds of tradition. You glance at your feet. Mud again. A leftover apple core. And hoofprints from an animal clearly not impressed with the ceremony. But you're not bothered anymore. In fact, you smile, because whether peasant or noble, rich or wretched, everyone had one thing in common: they made it work, even if they had to step around pigs to do it. The village is quiet again. A lantern flickers in the window of the scribe's cottage, and you follow the soft scrape of a quill against parchment. Inside, a balding man with ink-stained fingers is hunched over a ragged book. His job? Recording the dirty weddings, clean records of an entire generation. Because as bizarre as pigsty weddings might seem, many of them weren't just remembered, they were written down. And those written records, They've survived centuries of fire, war, and mildew to tell us something vital. Even the muckiest marriages were legally binding, and someone was always keeping track. In the corner of the scribe's cottage sits a massive tome with water damage, hay pressed between the pages, and chicken footprints across the front. You peer over his shoulder as he mutters, March 17th, Alric, son of Dean, wed to Elsa, near the pig pen south of the mill. Witnesses, Marta the brewer, Edric the potboy, one white sow. That's not a joke. That's evidence. Historians still argue whether these records were created for love of truth or for fear of lawsuits. Likely both, because the moment someone disputed a marriage, whether about inheritance, legitimacy, or land, these scribbled notes became gold. A notary's mention of a pigsty ceremony might be the only proof that a woman was truly wed and her children rightful heirs. And those notaries, they went where the action was. If a couple insisted on marrying beside their livestock, the notary just brought extra boots. Some even created travel kits, ink flask, parchment scraps, wax seal, and a waxed cloak to guard against splashes from weather or pigs. One fringe detail from 15th century Italy. A scribe invented a special shorthand for barn weddings, two looping marks and a squiggle that meant witnessed in stable with animal present. We don't know what animal, just an animal. You flip through more pages and find the same patterns. Wed behind pigsty, oaths exchanged at well, union solemnized in goat shed. These weren't exceptional, they were normal, which tells us that medieval folks weren't improvising. They were operating within a known and accepted system. Some parishes even had pre-written forms for outdoor or non-church weddings. Just leave a blank for location of ceremony and hope no one minds when the answer is next to dung heap behind granary. Now, there were risks. If no scribe or priest was present and the witnesses were dead, away, or just bad with memory, the union could be disputed, especially if one party tried to marry again. Courts saw plenty of cases where someone claimed, "We said our vows beside the pigs," only to be told, "Prove it." That's when things got messy. One court record from 1324 describes a woman who called 12 witnesses to prove she was married near a pigsty. They all agreed the pig had tripped during the vows and that it was an omen of marital fidelity. The judge, unable to argue with such detail, ruled in her favor. Records like these aren't just legal relics, they're human moments frozen in ink. A bride's nervous laugh, a pig's inopportune squeal, the way mud stuck to a notary's boot as he scratched out the word lawful. And the best part? These marriages lasted. Because the documentation wasn't just for show, it protected lives. A poor widow with a pigsty wedding in the books could claim her husband's land. A child born of such a union was legitimate in the eyes of both church and kingdom. Even royalty acknowledged the validity of these ceremonies. King Edward I once ruled in favor of a woman whose only proof of marriage was a scribe's note stating, "Vows exchanged behind hog shelter in view of 5." That note preserved her future and her sons. You watch as the scribe dips his quill again and writes, July 12th, Tilda and Haman joined in marriage beside family pig pen. Witness, one angry goose. He pauses, smiles, underlines it, and just like that, another pigsty wedding enters history. Not in a cathedral, not on parchment adorned with gold leaf, but in the scribbled memory of someone who saw mud, heard laughter, and knew that something real had happened. Outside the scribe's cottage, the air is thick with wood smoke and the gentle complaints of overfed pigs. You pass a fence where someone's tacked up a crude drawing, two figures holding hands next to a very round sow. The caption reads, "True love oinks." It's charming and surprisingly accurate, but not everyone agreed. You head toward a chapel on the edge of the village. It's small, half collapsed, its bell long stolen or forgotten. A man in tattered robes stands at the door. His face is flushed, his hands tremble, not from age or piety, but from outrage. Because sometimes, when villagers married without the church tried to fight back. You're about to learn what happened when the priest refused. He grips the doorframe tightly, eyes fixed on the distance, as if he's still trying to exorcise the memory of what he saw, a wedding, in a pigsty without him. You see, not all clergy took pigsty weddings in stride. Some absolutely lost their minds over them. These priests and bishops, fueled by pride, doctrine, or fear of irrelevance, would refuse to recognize such unions, even if they met all the legal requirements. Historians still argue whether this was doctrinal overreach or genuine concern for the sanctity of marriage. One side insists these priests were defending spiritual order. The other suggests they were just annoyed they weren't paid. Either way, there were consequences. Imagine being in love, exchanging vows before witnesses, and then being told your marriage doesn't count because the priest wasn't there to bless your pig. It happened, and the fallout could be brutal. Denied sacraments, shunned children, even fines. One fringe case from 1402 tells of a couple in East Anglia who married behind their cottage with 5 witnesses and a duck. Standard. The priest refused to record the union, claiming it was offensive to heaven. The couple appealed to the bishop, who sided with them and scolded the priest for over-exaggerated delicacy. But in other places, couples weren't so lucky. Some priests barred newlyweds from communion. Others denied last rites or church burials to mud-married families. One cleric in Flanders reportedly chased a bride from the chapel steps with a broom for daring to approach after her stye-side vows. The church issued edicts, councils passed rules, and still villagers kept marrying where they lived, in barns, kitchens, fields, and yes, pigsties. Why? Because it was faster, cheaper, and ironically, more in line with the church's own teachings about consent and public vows. It became a legal and spiritual tug of war. In areas where priests were absent or untrained, couples had no choice. They'd perform the vows themselves and hope the community remembered. Sometimes, if the priest later refused to acknowledge it, the couple would simply live together and raise a family anyway. The church called it sin. Villagers called it marriage. You step into one such home, a narrow timbered hut with low beams and the smell of onion soup hanging in the air. The couple here has been together for 20 years. They married beside their sty in the spring of 1393, with 7 neighbors and 1 belligerent goose in attendance. The priest, he said no, so they kept living, raising children, tending pigs, and when the priest finally retired, the new one, young, sunburnt, a little nervous, blessed the couple quietly behind the chapel. No sermon, just a nod, a whispered prayer, and a smile. That's how change happens, one tiny compromise at a time. These refusals, however harsh, often failed, not because the church was powerless, but because the villagers were persistent. They had traditions, witnesses, and generations of pig-wedding veterans ready to argue back. The priest could grumble, but love, poverty, and a good pig, that was a holy trinity of its own. And so the bride walks past the chapel with her piglet in tow, unbothered by the fuming priest. Her neighbors wave. Her mother beams. She may not have the church's paperwork yet, but she has a sty full of witnesses and a village that knows her truth. Sometimes that was enough. You follow the bride as she strolls past the chapel, a skip in her step and a piglet tugging at its leash behind her. But don't get too comfortable, because not everyone in the church let these pigsty weddings go unchallenged. In fact, one man tried to wipe them out completely. It didn't go well. Tonight you'll meet a bishop whose grand crusade against sty-side weddings turned into the scandal of smelly vows, a cautionary tale of what happens when religious authority underestimates pig-headed villagers. Literally, we're in 15th century England now. Picture it, a wealthy, fussy bishop named Alfric of Wensham. He wore fur-lined vestments, traveled with 2 scribes and a personal cup-bearer, and was known for his deep hatred of irregular marriages. To him, weddings outside the church weren't just inconvenient, they were blasphemous. So, Alfric declared war on pigsty weddings. His first move? A sweeping edict. All marriages in his diocese must occur inside consecrated buildings, with bands, witnesses, priests, and no animals present. Violators would be fined, their children deemed illegitimate, and their pigs, if involved, could be confiscated. That's right. The bishop threatened to excommunicate pigs. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine attempt at reform or just Alfric trying to flex his authority. Some claim he was worried about theological integrity. Others suspect he just couldn't stand the smell. Whatever his motives, the villagers were not impressed. Word spread fast. In hamlets and pastures across the region, people mocked the bishop's decree. One village drew a cartoon of Alfric marrying a pig. Another wrote a ballad titled The Bishop and the Bacon. Even his own priests began to quietly roll their eyes. But the real blow came when Alfric tried to enforce the law personally. He marched into a village called Thistlecroft, robes billowing, voice booming, just in time to interrupt a wedding beside a sty. He demanded the couple stop. The bride, hands on hips, hair full of straw, said, "Your Grace, we're nearly done." The crowd laughed. Then someone threw a turnip, and then came the pigs. One particularly large sow, startled by the bishop shouting, bolted into the crowd, knocking over the bishop's cupbearer and smearing Alfric's white robes with a streak of something unholy. The bishop slipped, fell face first into a water trough, and had to be helped out by 2 children and a goose. The wedding? It went on without him. From that day forward, Alfric's campaign lost steam. His priests stopped enforcing the rules. His scribes quietly removed the pigsty clauses from the parish notices. And in Thistlecroft, couples continued to wed beside their pigs, now with a new tradition, a ceremonial toss of a turnip in honor of the fallen bishop. One fringe result, a tiny chapel was later built in the village next to the pigsty, so couples could have the best of both worlds. Locals called it the Chapel of Mud and Mercy. Services included hay seating and a warning about loose chickens. But Alfric's story wasn't just slapstick. It revealed something deeper, the stubborn endurance of local customs. Villagers weren't being rebellious. They were being practical. Weddings near pigs were about proximity, economy, and community. The church could fume, fine, and flail, but at the end of the day, love in muddy boots was still love. You sit now on a fence beside another wedding in progress. A ribbon hangs from the sty door. The couple holds hands. A dog barks. A pig sneezes. It's far from perfect, but it's perfectly real. And somewhere deep in a forgotten corner of a dusty cathedral, Bishop Alfric is still frowning. But the villages, they're still smiling. By now you've seen enough to know that a pigsty wedding wasn't just a fluke of poverty or a punchline in a priest's complaint. It was a living tradition, gritty, heartfelt, occasionally ridiculous, and it echoed far beyond the medieval era. Because just when you think the story ends in mud, it ripples outward. You begin to notice traces of these rustic roots in places you'd never expect. This is the chapter of echoes into the present, where the grunts and giggles of medieval weddings somehow survived the centuries. You're strolling through a modern-day village fair in Eastern Europe. Romania, maybe. Music plays, and someone in traditional dress tosses flower petals at a couple posing beside a wooden fence. Behind them, a very photogenic pig wearing a bow. It's not satire, it's heritage. Across rural parts of Europe, especially in places less disrupted by industrialization. Folk wedding customs still reflect those old muddy beginnings, open air ceremonies, animal blessings, public vows on farmland. Even now, some families intentionally stage their weddings near stables or in barns to honor their ancestors. They call it old style. Grandma just calls it how it was always done. Historians still argue whether these folk rituals are true survivals or romantic reinventions. Some say they're faithful echoes of medieval customs. Others believe modern nostalgia dressed them up with lace and folklore. Either way, the fact remains pigsty weddings left footprints. One fringe example, in parts of rural Wales, it's still considered good luck for the bride to feed a piglet the morning of her wedding. Not a metaphor, an actual piglet. The tradition is called Porchel Bach, literally little pig, and it's believed to bless the union with fertility and abundance. Elsewhere, in parts of Austria and Hungary, newlyweds are encouraged to walk through the barn together after the ceremony, to greet the animals who watch them grow. In medieval terms, this would have been the wedding itself. Today, it's a quaint bonus photo op, but the impulse is the same. And don't forget the rise of the rustic barn wedding trend. Hay bales, reclaimed wood, burlap bunting, a couple posing with livestock. You might call it aesthetic. Medieval peasants might call it Tuesday. The irony? Many modern barn weddings cost more than an entire village's annual income in 1386. But the setting still whispers of something older, the idea that love doesn't need marble arches, it just needs room to breathe. Even in literature and film, the pigsty wedding has left its mark. You've seen the archetype, two muddy lovers, defying convention, sealing their future with nothing but their words and a sunset. That's not Hollywood invention. That's a narrative passed down from generations of real, muck-covered couples who meant every word they said. And yes, some of those ancient vows are still said today. I plight thee my troth wasn't just flowery English. It was the legal phrase you had to speak in front of a crowd, pig or no pig. In certain reenactment weddings or heritage ceremonies in places like northern France or Scotland, the same words echo down through time. You pause beside a field where children are playing wedding with their goats. One has a ribbon, another a stick pretending to be a bishop's staff. There's no cake, no candles, no DJ booth, but the joy, authentic, and the pig in the corner, watching like it knows it's part of something older than anyone realizes. So maybe the story of pigsty weddings didn't end in the Middle Ages. Maybe it just evolved, got cleaner, got rebranded. But the heart of it, the simplicity, the symbolism, the shared laughter in a space you know by heart, that's still alive, just dressed in linen instead of mud. And in a world that loves glitter but often forgets meaning, maybe that old muddy tradition still has something to teach. It's late now. The village has settled into its evening hush. Smoke drifts lazily from chimney holes, and the soft clink of tin cups signals the end of another feast, or at least another warm bowl of barley stew. The pigs are asleep in their pens, and across the dirt paths and crooked fences, one final wedding begins. This one is quieter than all the rest. Just a man, a woman, one neighbor wrapped in a shawl, and the rhythmic snuffle of a sow nearby. There are no flowers, no feast, not even a scribe this time. But there is sincerity, and in the glow of a single lantern they clasp hands and whisper vows. You've come full circle to a soft hay and lasting love kind of moment. One last sty-side wedding, not because they must, but because it's home. They stand in the straw, fingers laced, barely taller than the old fence post behind them. The woman wears a patched cloak. The man tugs at his sleeve, suddenly nervous. A pig stirs nearby, glances at them, and goes back to sleep. And just like that, it's done. No altar, no cathedral, no parade, just them and a life ahead. Here, in this humble space, all the contradictions of the medieval wedding come together. It is sacred, yet filthy, legal, yet wildly informal, laughed at, but deeply remembered. A joining of lives not by gold or title, but by choice, and a very low tolerance for ceremony. Even the most grandiose weddings today, with flower walls and drone footage, can't quite replicate the truth of these moments. The way people bound themselves together with mud still on their boots and calluses still on their hands. The pigsty wasn't second best. It was enough. Enough to build a home. Enough to share the burden. Enough to be seen. Historians still argue whether pigsty weddings should be treated as footnotes or folk tales. But here's what matters. They happened, often, legally, proudly. They weren't strange at the time, just normal life, captured in the frame of livestock and love. One fringe case worth ending on. In 1478, a priest recorded a wedding that took place in a half-collapsed grain barn during a thunderstorm. The couple couldn't afford the church's door fee. The rain was so loud no one could hear the vows. But afterward, the bride turned to her new husband, held out her hand, and said, "Come, let's feed the pigs together." The priest wrote, "I could think of no more perfect benediction." And neither could we. Now the village fades behind you. The firelight dims. The hay underfoot quiets your steps. All around, the world breathes slower. You picture them, those countless couples over countless muddy years, joining hands not in palaces or sanctuaries, but in fields and barns and pigsties, places they knew by heart, spaces that smelled of effort, of food, of stubborn daily love. The vows were spoken with cracked lips. The promises came with no guarantees except that tomorrow there'd be more to carry together. Water, wood, children, and yes, pigs. It's easy to romanticize the past. But it's also easy to forget that simplicity is not the same as lack. These people may not have had fine clothes or polished silver, but they had commitment, they had witnesses, they had mud, and somehow that was enough to make a marriage last. So tonight, as you settle deeper under your blanket, think of those couples, not their hardships, but their courage, their small smiles, their shared strength. And if your day was messy or your home imperfect, take comfort. Great love has always started in humble places, sometimes even ankle deep in muck. The lantern dims, the pigs snore, the vows echo softly into sleep.